Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. Today I'm looking at some UK politics and the concept of ministerial responsibility. So this is part of component 2 of edXL A-level politics, and it's part of the element where we look at Prime Minister and Cabinet, essentially the executive in the UK. It's a really important underlying principles that are involved in this. These underlying principles are the concept of individual ministerial responsibility and the concept of collective ministerial responsibility. So this is section 3.2 of component 2 of A-level politics, and there's some really important stuff in this. Now, collective government and cabinet government are really important principles in the UK political system. And it means that we don't have ministers picking and choosing bits of government policy that they like. It means that if you're having a minister interviewed and then there's something outside their jurisdiction and they don't like what's going on, so they're foreign secretary but they don't like a bit of domestic policy, then they can't just turn around and go, well, yeah, I know, I argued against that, I don't like it, so I'll tell you about the bit I'm doing, but that bit I'm not interested in. It does have some kind of weird effects, actually, in terms of the way that I think we end up with perceptions of politics and the way that it works. But we're going to dig down and have a deeper look at these issues and then hopefully some really helpful and relevant examples for you of things that have been involved affecting both individual ministerial responsibility and collective ministerial responsibility from recent governments. To start off with, then, we're going to look at the concept of individual ministerial responsibility, and this is about the fact that ministers are accountable to Parliament for the policies of their department, the conduct of their department, and, as the term suggests, their own personal conduct. So individual ministerial responsibility is about them running their department, but it's also about them behaving themselves and sticking to the ministerial code. And essentially, to go back to an old American president saying, in their department, the buck stops with them. So if there are failings in their department, then you'd expect them to take responsibility for it. But it's never quite that straightforward. So often what will happen is there will be failings in a department and the blame will go on the civil servant. So the minister will say, so yes, there was these failings in my department, but it was down to civil servants and they made these mistakes, or they failed to act on this occasion when this was needed. The minister has to inform Parliament about this kind of stuff happening, but they don't necessarily have to resign because they can claim it wasn't their fault. Now, the government departments are enormous, so on the other hand, you could say expecting the minister to have full knowledge of everything going on would be asking too much. Also, we have to remember the ministers are non-experts and they are surrounded by expert civil servants who are supposed to know what is actually going on. Now, this thing has all been more complicated, and in one of my previous videos when we looked at kind of the departments and things like that, we saw that, well, actually, a lot of stuff is now done by these executive agencies, and there's this huge number of executive agencies that are controlled by the different department. And so actually the failings might well happen within the executive agency, and therefore it might be the head of the executive agency that carries the can for it, rather than necessarily the minister who's further up the food chain. If a minister knowingly misleads Parliament, then they should resign. An example of a resignation linked to misleading Parliament is Amber Rudd in 2018, and she misled Parliament over a target on removing illegal immigrants and whether there was one, and she said she only inadvertently misled Parliament, most importantly in a select committee. She'd also been heavily criticised for mishandling of the Windrush scandal. She had taken over from May, who was Prime Minister at the time, and therefore had previous handlings of Windrush. So it was all fairly complicated. So Amber Rudd resigned for misleading Parliament, though she claims it was inadvertent and therefore not knowingly. Now, this concept of ministerial responsibility, individual ministerial responsibility, is a really important one, and underlying it is some fairly strong principles about how a minister should behave, set out in the ministerial code of conduct. And essentially, any minister breaking the ministerial code should resign. Now we've seen quite interesting example of this fairly recently, where Priti Patel came under very strong criticism following allegations of her bullying a top civil servant. In fact, her bullying multiple people in multiple departments where she'd worked. The civil servant involved in the particular accusation, Sir Philip Rutman, has since received a very sizable payout from the government, and there was an inquiry carried out into this by Sir Alex Allen. And essentially, this next bit is a series of his findings. My advice is that the Home Secretary has not consistently met the high standards required of the ministerial code of treating her civil servants with consideration and respect. Her approach on occasions has amounted to behaviour that can be described as bullying in terms of the impact felt by individuals. To that extent, her behaviour has been in breach of ministerial code. And then this is the bit that essentially saves Priti Patel and is highly controversial. This bit, even if unintentionally. So essentially what he's saying is that Priti Patel did bully this individual and other individuals, but because nobody told her the impact that her behaviour was having on others and was unaware of its impact, then this could be deemed to be unintentional. And because of that little bit in there, John Johnson was able to issue a statement saying that she continued to have his full confidence, and she did not resign. Now, there was a huge call from the media and the opposition and many others for her to resign, but that little bit, that keyword unintentionally in Sir Alex Allen's findings, essentially saved her. Now, it is an unusual event, and again, through many years of watching UK politics, I've seen ministers resign over a lot less, and there was the normal public outcry that there normally is when a minister has seen to done something wrong, and particularly when the press scents blood. Really, they do like to hound a minister out of office, but it was, again, in this, it's a really nice example to use because it shows a large degree of flexibility about what is and isn't accepted, and it also shows a huge amount of power on behalf of the Prime Minister. So Johnson could well have turned around and demanded her resignation, but instead he turned around and gave her his full confidence. And this will link into something I'm going to talk about later on, which is in terms of the Prime Minister's power. So resignations do take place, and some of them have been over misleading Parliament. We've seen Amber Rudd, one as an example already. There was also Damien Green in 2017 about some stuff that on his computer that shouldn't have been there. If there are mistakes made within their department, then theoretically a minister could go based on that. But normally they tend to blame the civil servants beneath them, and they tend to survive. If there's failures in policy, then again a minister may well go, but they may be moved on in a reshuffle on that. It can be personal misconduct. So Priti Patel, again, in 2017, was forced to resign following unsanctioned meetings with representatives from Israel. Michael Fallon resigned in 2017 after some fairly shocking revelations about his actions towards numerous women. Now, the resignations can come down to political pressure. I mean, largely something linked to one of the categories above, but where you get a kind of media frenzy, and essentially once the media get their teeth into a minister and it starts, they become the story and it's a scandal, then eventually normally a Prime Minister kind of pushes them to one side. Particularly if we go back into the 1990s, we had all the sleaze scandals and stuff like that. People didn't tend to survive these scandals. Now, some do now. And it depends on how willing to ride out the political storm a Prime Minister and that particular minister are. They often, again, the pressure becomes too much, the tension becomes too much, and they resign to spend more time with their families. Not always the case, but quite often. it can be down to disagreements with the Prime Minister. Now, we had a mass example of this when Johnson became Prime Minister, with Sir Alan Duncan, Anne Milton, David Gauke, Philip Hammond and Rory Stewart all resigning when Johnson became Prime Minister. And this was to do with disagreements over policy and principle, which then leads us into our next stage, which is about collective responsibility. So collective responsibility is the idea that ministers must support all government decisions in public, even if they argued against them in private. So it doesn't say that all ministers must agree on everything. They can, in cabinet meetings, argue, shout, scream, disagree. Now, you do, when you get these issues of absolute kind of political disagreement, then a minister will go, well, I can't stand up publicly and defend that policy. I won't stand up and publicly defend that policy. And so you see principled decisions like that made by Robin Cook in 2003, who said he would in no way would he support the war with Iraq, and so he resigned. There have been many resignations under May and Johnson over Brexit, and I just went through that long list of people who resigned when Johnson came into power. Ministers leaving, however, normally has more than a single issue behind it. It's normally a combination of different things. It might be a series of disagreements over time. It might be personality clashes. It might be to do with it might be power politics. It might be a whole range of different things. Now, cabinet discussions should be private. And I think that's something that needs reiterating at the moment, because they don't seem to be anymore. There has been a remarkable number of leaks during Johnson's time in office, notably over timings and extent of lockdown. At one point, there was even a full-blown investigation launched into this, taking such remarkable actions as actually the ministers having to have their phones checked by security staff and all kinds of things like that. So there's been some real problems with this. And the cabinet, again, according to the way the conventions in UK politics and collective responsibility, the cabinet should always outwardly appear to be completely united, and they should agree. And if you don't, then essentially you have to go. And ultimately can work the other way around. If enough of the cabinet dislike an argument from a prime minister, and the prime minister can't get something through cabinet, then and tries, then the prime minister should go. The cabinet and therefore the government goes as a whole if it's defeated in a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons. So this idea of the cabinet working together and it being a collective is a really important one. And if you decide that you cannot stay within that collective, then you should resign and you should leave. And you should also not tell anybody about the different arguments that are going on. Now, there is a problem in terms of this, I think, in terms of public discourse, but it is a principle in UK politics. The secrecy bit, it does not seem to be one that has been well adhered to in the last couple of years. There are exceptions to collective responsibility, and two most notable examples of this have been during referendums over Europe, one in 75 and the other one in 2016. So in these periods, what the prime ministers did, so first of all Wilson and then more recently Cameron, is they suspended collective responsibility, allowing members of the cabinet to argue and campaign on the opposite sides of the referendum. There was one difference in this, is Cameron actually led the Remain campaign, something Wilson kind of stayed out of it. And the only rule in 2016 was that members of the cabinet couldn't attack membership of the EU from the dispatch box in the House of Commons. Eric Heffer did and was sacked. Another interesting thing in terms of collective responsibility in recent years has been the coalition government, 2010 to 2015, and it had to essentially draw up its own rules, which again suggests that these things can be changed and altered. And the Lib Dems were not bound on collective responsibility over nuclear power, over tax allowances for married couples, over higher education funding, and over the Trident programme. And so on those issues, they could simply abstain, and the collective responsibility worked differently. They wouldn't be expected then to publicly support the government policy on it. The two parties also campaigned again on either side of the 2011 referendum, which was about proposing a change to the voting system, and again, so collective responsibility was suspended on that issue as well. Another area where collective responsibility can be removed is over what are known as free votes, and this is when essentially the government leadership determined, or Prime Minister determines that votes are a matter of conscience, not party policy. One of the most recent examples of this was over same-sex marriage in 2013, which carried, but there were a number of Conservatives that voted against it, including 2 cabinet ministers. But because this was a free vote and not a party vote, then they were not required to resign following that. Now, in my own personal view, I think there are some problems with collective responsibility. It does tend to lead to this idea in UK politics, particularly amongst the media coverage of politics, that the greatest weakness you can ever have is disunity. And this seems to me to stifle a degree of political debate, particularly when a party has a majority. And this goes back to all kind of structural things about how UK politics work. The opposition has very little chance of stopping legislation if a government has a strong majority. So only actual divisions within the governing party can stop or change legislation. And there's a worry in this because we've got the whip system and everything that we've looked at that is aimed in Parliament to keep the backbenchers under control. Well, if then on the front bench within the cabinet we've got this collective responsibility that stops them all expressing the fact that there are differing viewpoints on this thing, it tends to make everything very kind of partisan and unified and everybody saying the same thing. It's all done privately, the debate on it, and so the public are then presented with the idea that there is one idea from government. And then often the whole thing, because shadow cabinet kind of mimics the way a cabinet works, then shadow cabinet will present one alternative view. And so you're left with this kind of partisan kind of black and white, there's this view and there's this view and there's nothing else. Whilst actually there probably is a lot more common ground with variants of one side and variants on the other and all that kind of political discourse. And so it kind of gets lost when there aren't huge amounts of leaks. The other accusation, which is a more widely held criticism, is the idea that what collective responsibility does actually is, rather than empowering the collective as in empowering cabinet, it leads to prime ministerial dominance. And sometimes this can happen where cabinet is not properly consulted. This is definite accusations against both Thatcher and Blair, two of the stronger prime ministers that we've seen in the modern age. And there's accusations that Johnson's time as Prime Minister is going along similar lines, and shown by the resignation of Sajid Javid, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he refused to accept greater control from Johnson and Johnson's advisers over what was happening in his department, and he left on the basis of that. And therefore there is this accusation that Johnson, a bit like Thatcher and Blair in the past, just wants ministers who will accept what he wants and go along with him, and therefore limiting again the opportunity for debate and a range of ideas. So what we tend to see, because of collective responsibility, it can be argued, is internal dissent and leaks rather than resignations and open discourse. And so the debates I really want to happen in politics, they are happening. It's just they're happening behind closed doors, and we're just getting little bits of it leaked out, and it's all getting mixed in with all the power struggles and the personality clashes and stuff like that. And all of this actually can do quite a lot to damage the reputation of governments and politics in general. Of course, there is the counter argument that what we need is clarity, and what we need is that things are collectively agreed, and what we can't have is ministers picking and choosing which bits of government policy they agree with or not, because then we've got a clear idea of what the government stands for and what the government has done, and therefore that will improve accountability at elections, and it will improve scrutiny of government while things are in place. And if the shadow cabinet is working in the same way and presenting an alternative, then there is a clear choice for voters. So whilst I have pointed out some problems with collective responsibility, there are also a great deal of strengths as well. I hope that's been helpful for you. If it has, then please hit the like thing. If you've any questions or comments, then please leave those below. If you're interested in UK politics, you're interested in A-level politics in general, then please do subscribe. There's a whole series of videos covering all the stuff on Component 1 and Component 2 and Component 3A, which is the US unit which we teach, and all this and stuff on ideologies, on liberalism and socialism and nationalism that we cover. So there's a huge amount of stuff on here. There's also a whole range of playlists on different bits of history as well. So if you're studying those or just interested in those, then subscribe, turn on notifications, and hopefully there'll be lots more good videos coming through that will grab your interest. Thank you very much for watching.